The referral came through Marcus in the last week of May. He runs a group practice out of Cambridge, and every so often he sends me the people he doesn't have room for, or the ones he thinks would do better with someone quieter. His email was 3 lines. Young guy, 28, presenting with sleep issues and low-grade anxiety, nothing dramatic. No trauma history he had been able to draw out. Insurance was clean. Adrian could come Tuesdays at 4. My office is on the 2nd floor of a brownstone off Newbury, tucked between a dentist and a woman who does energy work she doesn't call energy work. 2 chairs, a rug my mother bought me when I opened the practice, and a window that looks out on a fire escape. In June, it gets warm in there around 3, and the AC struggles until I open the door to the hallway for 10 minutes between appointments. Adrian showed up 10 minutes early to the first session. He was thin, clean-shaven, wearing a gray button-down that was too warm for the weather. He shook my hand with the kind of grip you use when you are trying not to think about your hand. He sat down and looked at the rug for a while before he spoke. The first session was unremarkable in the way that always makes me want to schedule a second. He talked about his job, some kind of data work I didn't fully understand, said his mother had died when he was 19 and he was fine about it, said he'd had a girlfriend for 2 years, and they broke up in March. When I asked about the sleep issues, he said he was waking up around 4 every morning and couldn't get back down. When I asked what woke him, he said he didn't know, he just opened his eyes and the room was already there. I remember thinking that was a strange way to put it. I wrote it in the margin of my notes and moved on. He booked the second session on the way out. Paid in cash, which some people still do. He said thank you at the door, and then thank you again on the stairs. The second session was on a Tuesday. 90 degrees outside, the AC clicking. I remember I had eaten a bad salad for lunch and was trying not to think about it. Adrian sat down, adjusted his sleeves, and I asked him if anything had changed since we last spoke. He said the dreams were worse. I said, "You didn't mention dreams last time." He said, "I didn't want to lead with it." I nodded and asked him to tell me. He said it was a recurring dream he'd had for years. He wasn't sure how long. He described a room, yellow wallpaper with small blue flowers, the kind that repeats every 4 inches. A single bed with a brown quilt folded at the foot. A window on the left wall, closed, with a curtain that has a pull cord. On the floor next to the bed, a pair of children's shoes, brown leather, buckled, the left one tipped over. I did not move. He said in the dream he is standing in the doorway of this room. He knows he is not supposed to go in. He knows if he goes in, someone in the house will hear him. He said he can hear a woman humming in another part of the house, and the humming is not a song, it is a shape. Up and down, the same 4 notes. I was still not moving. My hands were on the arms of my chair, and I was aware of my hands. He said the light in the room was coming from the window, but the light was wrong. Yellow, but not sun yellow. It was the yellow of the wallpaper, like the wallpaper was making it. That is my dream. I have had it since I was 6. I have never described it to anyone, not to my husband, not to my own therapist, because I stopped seeing her before we ever got to it, not to my sister, not in a journal, because I don't keep one. The wallpaper, the shoes, the humming, the 4 notes, all of it. I asked him what he thought the dream meant, and I remember being surprised at how normal my voice sounded. He said he didn't know. That was why he was telling me. We had 30 more minutes. I ran the session the way I would have run it for anyone. I asked when the dream started, and he said he couldn't remember. It had always been there. I asked if anything in the dream changed over time, and he said no. It was the same every time. I asked if he ever went into the room. He said no. He said the point was that he never went in. At 10 to 5, I told him we had to stop for the day, and he nodded and stood up and thanked me and paid in cash again. When the door closed, I sat in my chair for a long time. The AC clicked. Someone in the hallway laughed at something on their phone. Somewhere on Newbury, a truck was backing up, that beeping sound they make. I drove home the long way, through Brookline, because I didn't want to be at red lights near people. When I got home, I told my husband I had a headache and went into the guest room and closed the door. I took a yellow legal pad off the shelf and I wrote down every single thing Adrian had said, word for word, in the order he had said it. Then I wrote down every detail of my dream underneath. I compared them, line by line, in the light of a lamp I'd had since college. They matched. The wallpaper pattern, the quilt, the window, the pull cord, the shoes, right down to the buckle, and the fact that the left one was tipped over. The humming. There were things he hadn't said. He hadn't described the smell in the room, which in my dream is like old milk. He hadn't described the ceiling, which has a water stain shaped like a hand. He hadn't described the second door on the far wall, which is the reason I know I can't go in, because the second door is where the humming is coming from, and I know that if I step inside the first door, the second door will open. I told myself there was a rational explanation. People share dream imagery. Yellow wallpaper is a common image. There is a whole story called that. Children's shoes appear in dreams all the time. Humming is common. Any 2 people could describe similar dreams, and if you cherry-picked the overlap, it would look like a match. I sat with that for a long time. It didn't hold. The next session was the following Tuesday. I spent the week rehearsing. I decided I would ask him a few careful questions, framed as clinical, and see what he did with them. I would not describe anything from my own dream. I would not lead him. If he was messing with me somehow, I wanted to see him work for it. If he wasn't, I wanted to know that too. He came in on time, same gray button down. He looked tired around the eyes. I asked him if the dream had come again. He said yes, twice. I asked him if there was anything about the room he hadn't mentioned last time. Any detail that stood out on a second look. He thought for a moment. He said, "There's a stain on the ceiling, above the bed. It's shaped kind of like a hand." He said it flat, the way you'd describe a coffee mug on a table. I kept my face where it was. I asked him if he ever smelled anything in the dream. He said, "It smells like the fridge at my grandmother's house. Milk that's gone." I said something back. I don't fully remember what. I ran the rest of the session on autopilot, and at one point, I asked him about his father, and he answered, and I did not hear the answer. At 5 to 5, I told him I had been thinking about his case, and I felt he would be better served by a colleague of mine who specialized in sleep disorders and parasomnias. I said I'd send the referral that evening. I made it sound like a compliment to him and a limitation on me. He said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you." He didn't ask any questions about it, which I remember thinking was strange, because most people ask at least one question when you hand them off. At the door, he stopped and turned back. He looked at the rug for a second, the way he had in the first session. Then he said, "I hope this helps you sleep better too." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, I said I hope this helps me sleep better." I heard what I heard. I know I did. But I also know what I want to have heard, and I could not tell you now, sitting here, which of those is more honest. I sent the referral that night. Marcus called me 2 days later and asked if everything was all right, because Adrian had not shown up to the appointment I set for him and had not answered any of the follow-up calls. I said I didn't know. I said sometimes people do that. Marcus said yeah, they do. I checked the intake form again. The phone number was disconnected. The address was a UPS store in Somerville. The emergency contact was blank, which I hadn't noticed the first time, because Marcus had already vouched for him and I'd gotten sloppy. That was almost 3 years ago. I still have the dream. I never used to talk about it, and I still don't, except for right now, here, because I don't know what else to do with it. It comes maybe once a month. The wallpaper is the same. The shoes are still on the floor. The humming still comes from somewhere I can't see. There is a man in the doorway now. He is standing where I used to stand. He is looking into the room the way I used to look into it. He is very still, and he is wearing a gray button down, and he is waiting for something. And I am inside the room now, on the bed, and I understand that the humming has stopped. The first morning I saw them, I thought a deer had wandered up. Deer come near my porch in winter for the salt block I put out. But when I stepped off the front step with my coffee and looked down at the fresh snow, they weren't hooves. They were 5 toes and a heel, pressed clear into the crust. I set my mug on the railing and walked the length of the porch in my slippers. The tracks came out of the tree line behind the woodshed, crossed my driveway, went along the north side of the house, curved past the propane tank, and headed back into the woods on the south side. One clean loop, all the way around, barefoot. It had gotten down to about 7 degrees the night before. I checked because I always check before I go to bed. My furnace runs propane, and the tank was low that week, and I was rationing. I stood there long enough that my coffee went cold. I remember that because I dumped it into the snow and watched a little brown crater melt down into the print of a right foot. Then I filled the mug back up inside and told myself somebody must have been drunk. Some kid dared his friend. It's a rural stretch, kids do stupid things, and the old logging track behind my property connects to a snowmobile trail that runs down toward the village. I live off a dirt road about 8 miles outside Danville, Vermont. Closest neighbor is a mile away. Closest streetlight is farther than that. The second morning I went out before the sun was up. Fresh snow had come down around midnight, maybe 2 inches, and there, in the fresh snow, were the tracks again. Same size, same barefoot, same loop coming out of the trees, all the way around the house, back into the trees. I'm 73 years old. My husband Ray passed in 2018, and I have lived alone since. I have a shotgun in the front closet that belonged to him, and I have a hip that doesn't like the cold, and I have a phone that gets 1 bar of signal if I stand near the kitchen window. That's what I was working with. I called Curtis. Curtis lives closer to the paved part of the road and plows my driveway for a bottle of bourbon at Christmas. He came over that afternoon in his Silverado, and he walked the loop with me twice, chewing the inside of his cheek the way he does. "Somebody's messing with you," he said. Then, after another minute, "In bare feet?" "In bare feet." He rubbed his jaw. He said he'd come back the next morning and we'd have another look. That night, I did not sleep well. I sat in the recliner in the living room with the shotgun across my knees and every light in the house off, except the little bulb over the stove. I thought if somebody was coming up on the house, I'd hear them. The place is old, and the boards on the porch talk when anything heavier than a cat crosses them. Around 2:30, I got up to use the bathroom. When I came back to the recliner, I looked out the front window and there was fresh snow falling. Just a light dusting, the kind that hisses down on the shingles if you listen for it. I sat down and I stared at that window until the sky started to lighten. No footsteps on the porch, no voices, no engine down at the road, nothing. At 6, I put my boots on over my pajamas and went outside. The loop was there, fresh prints in the fresh snow. Right past the porch I had been staring at. I stood in the driveway and I said out loud, "How?" Not as a question, just the word. That was when it started to get under my skin, because I had been awake. I had been looking. And whoever it was had walked within 20 feet of me, and I hadn't heard a thing. Over the next week, it happened 5 more times. Every snow, new prints. On the nights it didn't snow, I couldn't tell, because the crust of the old snow was hard enough that a barefoot person wouldn't leave much. Curtis measured a print with a tape measure and said it was about a size 10, maybe 11. He said the stride was even. Whoever it was wasn't running and wasn't limping, just walking. One loop, always counterclockwise, always finished. One afternoon, I put on my boots and my heavy coat, and I followed the tracks backward from where they came out of my tree line. I got maybe 100 yards in before my hip made me stop. The prints went straight into the woods without wandering. They didn't slow at a tree to lean on. They didn't stop to look at anything. Deliberate. Whoever was walking knew where he was going, even doing it in the dark, even half-dressed. I turned around and I came back, and I did not go into the woods again. I stopped going out after dark. I locked doors I hadn't locked in 20 years, including the one to the cellar that doesn't even latch right. I unplugged the phone and plugged it back in 3 times to make sure the dial tone was there. I filled up the propane and I told the delivery man about the tracks. He laughed and said maybe it was Bigfoot, and I laughed too because that's what you do. At night, I sat in the recliner with the shotgun and I did not laugh. The thing that got to me most wasn't that someone was out there. It was the barefoot part. Vermont in December is not a place a person walks around barefoot. Your toes go white in 5 minutes. You lose them. I have known men who lost toes to less. Whoever was making those tracks was doing something to himself that a person in his right mind does not do. I told Curtis I wanted a camera. He drove down to the hardware store in St. Johnsbury and came back with one of those little battery models that clips onto a screw, the kind hunters use for deer. He mounted it on the corner of the woodshed so it looked across the north side of the house, where the tracks always passed, closest to the wall. He showed me how the memory card worked. It records when it sees movement, he said. Battery's good for a couple weeks in the cold, maybe less. That was a Tuesday. It snowed Wednesday night. Thursday morning, Curtis came over with his laptop, and we sat at my kitchen table with the wood stove going, and he plugged the card in. There were a lot of clips of nothing, a branch moving, a rabbit, the shadow of a cloud crossing the yard. He scrolled through them fast, muttering, then he stopped. The clip was 14 seconds long. The timestamp said 2:47 a.m. A man walked across the frame from left to right. Young, maybe 25, if that. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, nothing on his feet. His arms hung at his sides and he looked straight ahead, not at the house, not at the camera, not at anything. His face was slack the way a face is when a person is not really using it. He walked at a steady, unhurried pace, and he walked out of the frame on the right side, and that was the end of the clip. Curtis leaned back in his chair. He said one word. He said the boy's first name. I won't put it here because his mother is a decent woman, and this isn't a story I want getting back to her more than it already has. You know him? I asked. I know his people. They live out past the reservoir. His mother works at the co-op. We watched the clip 3 more times. He never looked at the camera. He never looked at the house. He walked the way you walk down a hallway at home in the middle of the night to get a glass of water. Familiar. Blank. Curtis called the boy's father from my kitchen phone. I made more coffee, and I didn't listen too close because it wasn't my conversation. What I got from Curtis afterward was this. The boy had walked in his sleep since he was little. His parents used to find him in the yard. When he got older, they thought he'd grown out of it because he stopped showing up in the yard. They didn't know he was going further. They didn't know he was going almost 2 miles out, past the reservoir, across the county road, up through my woods, around my house, and almost 2 miles back. Every night, barefoot, in the dark. His father drove out that same afternoon and looked at the tracks with his own eyes. He was a big man in a Carhartt jacket, and he stood in my driveway and he cried a little, not making a sound about it, just standing there with his face wet. He said thank you about 6 times. He said they'd been so sure the boy was in bed. They started locking his bedroom from the outside after that, bolted the windows, put a bell on the door. His mother sent me a card at Christmas with a picture of a cardinal on it and a note that said, God bless you, thank you, we didn't know. The tracks stopped. I still walk the perimeter of the house most mornings out of habit. The snow is smooth now, just my own boot prints going out and coming back, and sometimes a squirrel. I think about that boy sometimes, not in a bad way. In the video, he looked calm. He looked like he was doing something that made sense to him, even if none of us knew what. Whatever pulled him out into the cold every night, all the way to my house and back, was something quiet. He never came up on the porch. He never tried a door. He made his circle and he went home. I hope wherever he is now, he sleeps. The organ came in at 4:47 a.m. from a hospital outside St. Louis, and by 5:10, we were already scrubbing. That is the part civilians don't understand about hearts. You don't get to sit with it. Cold ischemic time on a heart is 4 hours if you're lucky, 6 if you're pushing it, and every minute you spend admiring the paperwork is a minute the muscle is dying in a plastic box. Our recipient was a 58-year-old man named Robert. End-stage cardiomyopathy, been on the list 11 months. Wife in the waiting room with a rosary she kept turning in her hands like she was trying to wear a groove into her thumb. I had checked on her before I went to scrub. She thanked me by name. That felt heavier than it should have. The attending was Dr. Halverson. He had done maybe 400 of these. Slow hands, quiet voice, never raised it at a nurse in 15 years, and had the reputation to prove it. Perfusionist was Marco. Circulator was Beth. Scrub tech was Priya, and I was second assist. Everything about the case was normal. The courier came through the OR doors with the transport cooler at 5:24, standard Paragonics, ice pack indicator green, GPS tag intact. I checked the seal, checked the donor ID against Robert's chart, checked cross-match, checked ABO. Beth checked all of it after me. Halverson checked all of it after Beth. That is how it works. 3 sets of eyes on a piece of another human being before anyone opens the door on the recipient's chest. Robert was already open. Marco had him on bypass. Halverson looked at me across the table, nodded once and said, "Let's see it." Priya cracked the seal on the container. I've opened a lot of those coolers. The smell is always the same. Cold saline, faint plastic, something faintly meaty under it that you stop noticing after your first year. Nothing about this one was different. The heart was in its inner bag, submerged in preservation solution, pale and firm, the way a good donor heart is supposed to be. Priya lifted it out with both hands and set it in the sterile bowl. Halverson took it from her and turned it in his palms to inspect it. He does this with every organ. Runs his thumb along the great vessels, checks the atrium, looks for any bruising or nick from the procurement team. Standard. He rotated it, tilted his head, and stopped. He didn't say anything for maybe 4 seconds. In an OR, 4 seconds is a long time. Then he said, "Bring the light down." Beth swung the overhead in closer. I stepped around to his side of the table to see what he was looking at. There was a mark on the posterior wall of the left ventricle. Small, maybe the size of a pencil eraser. At first I thought it was a bit of clot on the surface, or a piece of fat that hadn't been trimmed. Halverson dabbed at it with a gauze. It didn't come off. He held the heart closer to the light. It was ink. Black ink, in the shape of numbers. 4 digits, then a slash, then 2, then a slash, then 2 more. A date. Written on the muscle of the ventricle in a hand so small and neat, it looked stamped. October 14th, 21. That was the date on the wall clock behind me. I remember the sound of the bypass pump, that steady mechanical breathing. Nobody said anything for a full breath. Marco was watching his screen and didn't see what we were seeing. Anesthesia was behind the drape. Only 4 of us knew, in that moment, what was on the table. Priya broke it, quiet, almost like she was asking a question of herself. That wasn't there when we packed it. She had been on the receiving end. What she meant was the intake photo. All donor hearts get a photograph on arrival for chain of custody. She had taken it herself 20 minutes earlier. I had been standing right next to her. There had been no ink on that heart. Halverson turned the organ once more, slowly, like he was giving it a chance to become something else. It didn't. The digits were sharp, not smudged, not bleeding into the tissue. Whoever had put them there had used a needle, not a marker. You could see the tiny puncture pattern if you looked. I have assisted on cadaveric procurement. I know how a donor heart gets from a body to a bowl. It comes out through the sternum, gets flushed with cold cardioplegia on the back table, goes into 2 bags of preservation solution, goes into the cooler. Once the aorta is clamped, it is never out of gloved hands until that cooler lid closes. There is no window. There is no moment where somebody could hold that muscle and tattoo the back of the left ventricle with the exact date of the recipient's surgery, and even if there was, you would need to know 4 days in advance when Robert would be called in. We had only called him at midnight, 6 hours ago. I said, "Should we stop?" I meant it as a question, but it didn't come out as one. It came out flat. Halverson didn't look up. He said, "Robert is on pump. If we stop, he dies on this table. This heart is viable. We are going to put it in." Beth said, "Do you want me to page anyone?" "No." He said it without inflection. Then he added, "Priya, get my phone from my locker." She did. He had her hold it under the sterile drape and take 3 photographs of the heart, 1 straight on, 2 at angles, with the numbers clear in every frame. When she was done, he told her to put the phone back and re-scrub. Nobody spoke while she was out. The pump hissed. Marco called out numbers. Halverson kept the heart in the bowl and did not put it down. When Priya came back, we did the transplant. Honestly, it was the cleanest transplant I have ever been part of. The anastomoses lined up like they had been drawn for us. The heart pinked up on reperfusion faster than I have seen a heart pink up in my career. When Halverson came off cross-clamp, it started beating on its own before the pacing wires were in. Sinus rhythm, 62, rock solid. Robert closed at 9:41 a.m. In the locker room afterward, I sat on the bench and pulled up his donor packet on the tablet. Male donor, 31 years old, Missouri, motor vehicle accident, declared brain dead on the 10th. That was 4 days before our surgery. Body kept on support for organ recovery until the morning of the 14th. Procurement completed at 3:15 a.m. Cooler wheels up at 3:40. Wheels down at our dock at 5:18. 4 days between the moment his brain stopped and the moment his heart came out of a chest. On day 4, at 5:24 in the morning, in an OR in Chicago. That heart had a fresh date on it that had not existed in a photograph taken 20 minutes prior. I found Halverson in the alcove by the coffee machine, still in his cap, looking at nothing. I said, "Are you going to put it in the op note?" He said, "Put what in the op note?" I understood. I asked, "Are you going to call anyone?" He looked at me for a while, not hostile, just tired. In a way, I had never seen him tired. He said, "Call who?" I didn't have an answer to that. He said, "The heart is working. Robert is going to walk out of here. His wife is going to take him home." Anything I write down about what we saw takes that away from him and doesn't give it back to the donor. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I said I did. I ran into Priya in the parking garage later. It was raining, one of those Chicago October rains that feels like the lake is coming up out of the drains. She was smoking, which I didn't know she did. She held the pack out and I took one, which I didn't do, usually. She said, "I keep thinking about the numbers." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I photographed it before he opened the seal. There is a picture of that heart from 20 minutes before, in the same bowl, and it is clean." I said, "I know." She said, "So, what do I do with that?" I didn't say anything. She finished her cigarette and dropped it in the standing water by the tire of a Ford Explorer and said, "Nothing, right, we do nothing." I nodded. Halverson and I did another case together 2 weeks later, a valve, unremarkable. Neither of us said the word donor to each other again. Robert was discharged on post-operative day 7. Biopsy at 1 month showed no rejection. Biopsy at 3 months showed no rejection. Last I heard, he was back at work, and his wife had sent Halverson a card at Christmas. The photographs are somewhere on Halverson's personal phone. I have never asked to see them. Priya's intake shot is in the hospital PACS system, filed under the case number, still clean, still empty of any ink. Anyone looking at those 2 images side by side would see 2 different hearts, 20 minutes apart, in the same bowl, under the same 6 pairs of eyes. Nobody looks at those 2 images, side by side. That is the only reason it stays quiet. I still work there. I still scrub for hearts. I check the seals. I check the paperwork. I check the ABO, and when Priya lifts one out of the bag, I look at it before it goes in the bowl. Every time.